Where have all the men gone? That sounds a bit odd when I ask that. Where has manhood gone? Well, let's ask Betsy Hart, who is a writer and a broadcaster, a frequent guest on CNN and Fox News. She's in Chicago, a great city now. Welcome to you. Merry Christmas.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Merry Christmas to you, too. I'm delighted we can actually say Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays or some other euphemism. So,
it's compulsory here. We've got a place outside where we shoot people who don't say it. Now, is this true? Has there been an emasculation of greater society? Is manhood under threat?
I think it is under threat, Michael, and there's a couple of big hints to that. Not least of all, it's something a lot of people, at least here in the States, are talking about. But you can get some strong hints of it just by watching television. If you look at not only commercials, but sitcoms, dramas, husbands and fathers are always complete idiots who have to be saved from the day by their ever more intelligent and competent wives and children. And that's just one example of sort of the dumbing down of manhood we have, where it's sort of this, what I've come to call the man bad, woman good view of the world. And it's really unfortunate because then we find a whole lot of guys are playing Xbox in their parents' basements at the age of 26 and 27 instead of growing up and starting families, and it becomes this very difficult catch-22.
It's very true, I have to say, and I don't have any particular agenda in terms of men's issues, but for years now on TV, the father is sometimes a nice, kind figure, but he's bumbling and he gets it wrong. And it's always the mother who says, unless he's a single father, which hardly ever happens, but the single fathers, they're okay, but otherwise he's a bit of a clown, isn't he?
Yes, and even then, he sort of needs the women from the neighborhood to show him how to raise his children and so on. Yes, and then when you do see the more masculine qualities portrayed, it's very often in a very negative way. I mean, he's too competitive, and certainly he doesn't share his feelings enough. And we all have seen the shows, right, where you have these talk shows and the women are talking about their horrific boyfriends who aren't sensitive enough and don't care about their feelings and, oh, those awful brutes. But if those brutes were coming on and talking about their wives and saying, you know what, she's just not having enough sex with me, well, we can't have that discussion, or she's too sensitive, or she's too emotional, well, that's off the table. Everybody has to look one way more and more culturally, and more you have to look like a girl. And I think it's so unfortunate we're feminizing men instead of civilizing them, which has historically been the role that women have played. Now we just kind of want to make men into our best girlfriends, and I think it's very destructive for culture and family.
Now, this is good. I'm not going to talk about she's not having enough sex with me, because my wife might be watching, and it really will be a problem. But the idea of looking like a woman. Now, it's one thing to be groomed, to make sure that you don't smell bad. You know, I mean, I put on colognes and stuff like that. But there has been this tendency to almost blur the genders, where men, I don't mean they walk around saying, look at me, we're holding their muscles up, but they have become effete.
Yeah, we definitely have gotten into this sort of, this melding, if you will, this homogenized look that I think is not necessarily particularly attractive. I tend to like manly-looking men. But maybe that's just a signal of some other things that are going on in the culture when we really are sort of not valuing the more traditionally masculine qualities. And there's some reasons for that that don't have to do with feminism. I mean, we do have a economy now that really is beneficial to multitasking. It's more service-oriented. We don't physically need the brawn that perhaps we once did. Women are excelling in high schools and colleges, at least here in the United States. There's this phenomenon of the supergirl and all kinds of questions about where are the guys on college campuses, because it's the women who are applying more, getting in more, and then doing better once they get there. And the women tend to now, in most major cities in the United States, on average, young women are making more than their male counterparts, and on it goes. So some of this has to do with economics. Some of it has to do with a very feminist agenda that says the traditional male qualities of being competitive, of being a little more stoic, not always being so verbal, etc., are bad qualities. Instead of what we once understood, which is that men and women typically are different, and that's a good thing. We complement each other. Less and less today, I think we're accepting of that. That has implication for families and communities and children, and a lot of women who are single because they can't find good guys to marry.
But it's also the notion of sacrifice. It sounds archaic now, but if a ship was sinking, women and children first, which one feminist in this country said she thought was akin to hate speech, which is quite...
I mean, now if you were on the Titanic, there wouldn't be that chivalry. There would be everybody for himself, right? And one of the reasons that's important, Michael, is because we used to understand that men are typically physically stronger and more aggressive. They have all that testosterone.
Yeah.
They can either channel it for good when it comes to women, caring for children, providing for a family, or they can channel it for ill. And that's why the vast majority of people in prisons are men, and they're single men, because they've not channeled their aggressiveness rightly in a way that's helpful for society and for the culture and for the community. They've channeled it destructively. Well, now we have a lot of guys who just aren't channeling it at all, and we have a huge proportion. The latest check was around 25% of people in their mid-20s are living in their parents' basements. Most of those are men. They're much more likely to be living at home than women. And so then women are excelling in the world, and they're turning around and wondering about where all the good guys are. I think there's a lot of ways women play into this. And one of them, no doubt, is that women have become so sexually available outside of marriage, there's not as much reason anymore for guys to get married and have families. So that's another way that feminism, while it's done some good things, has really led to a whole lot of women in their 40s looking around and saying, where have all the good guys gone?
Yeah, but there's probably not a man over the age of 35 who hasn't come across attractive, lovely, bright women in their 40s who say, I can't find a guy. I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, there are legal consequences too. There is now an assumption within the legal system in Canada, I think the US is the same, that when it comes to a custody dispute or a separation, the father, I mean, I think invariably the mother probably should have custody, but the father is barely to be considered. If there's violence in the home, even if they've hit each other, it's the man who has to be punished. I think that's part of the consequence of this, isn't it?
Yes, we do see, and it is reflected, I think, a lot in our court system, a presumption of guilt on the part of men when it comes to pretty much anything. I mean, when it comes to relationships, it seems more and more it's always the fellow who wasn't listening. It's always the fellow who wasn't communicating, and on it goes. And in the court systems, I mean, you can hear horror stories on both sides, that women have really taken advantage of this. Other times you see men, when their wives walk out the door, being left very much holding the shaft. I mean, I'd personally love to go back to a fault-based divorce system in our courts so that you really do have to show who was more at fault in leaving the marriage and let the money and the children kind of follow the better parent, if you will. I don't think we're ever going to go back to that. But nonetheless, what we do need to do, and the way to get around this, or to start changing things, and I'm working on a book on this very topic, is to encourage women, I think it starts there, to value traditionally male qualities in men, and to value themselves a little more in their feminine qualities, and not suggest that we have to sort of merge into one being, but that we do, as different genders, have a lot to offer. We have a lot to offer the home and the family, and we need to kind of be rebuilding respect for that.
All right. I'm going to be a man here and say, you've got to be quiet now, because we've got... It's a real pleasure. Love to have you back on the show. That was terrific.
Great.
And again, have a wonderful Christmas. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much. Merry Christmas.
This, my friends, is how easy it is to sound pro-male these days. I mean, here we have a woman, obviously of the social conservative persuasion, who speaks in such a way that one would think, or should I say to the untrained ear, one would think was pro-male. Yet this woman, make no mistake about it, is a bigot, as bad as the most vile feminist, and in some instances, her ilk is even worse than the worst feminist out there. Why? Because her misandry is much harder to detect. Her misandry is wrapped up in and optimized to appeal to the primordial part of the male brain. Her misandry exists curled up in a chivalrous, hind-brained male blind spot where the male rationality and logicality cannot permeate. This is evidenced by the matter-of-fact tone in which her and her white knight interviewer calmly, as if the topic of discussion was a routine weather forecast, discuss how men have lost their chivalry by refusing to die so that women may live on sinking ships. This is the modus operandi of the other feminism, the other side of the coin. I'm not going to call it traditionalism and white knightery. It's simply another form of feminism, since what feminism is merely a vehicle for female advocacy that acts on behalf of women. Feminism is the female herd desire for protection and provision, combined with a jealousy of the ones which provide that protection and provision. Feminism is active misandry, and traditionalism is its passive counterpart. Traditionalism is an indifference and entitlement toward male suffering, while feminism is a pursuer of it. In traditionalism, we see this detached female advocacy at all costs whenever these conversations of sinking ships and what men should or shouldn't do in the event that they find themselves on one come up. You know, I've described it as misandry above, but it should be noted that this misandry is a cold, detached one. I mean, we don't see a seething hatred here of men, but we see a hatred of entitlement. This woman considers men to be such a lower form of life that it never even occurs to her that men want to live just as much as women do, that they may not want to die for some archaic rules of gender conduct, that they have minds and souls and dreams of their own. All we see is this oblivious female dullard and her white knight protesting that men aren't acting like the utilities they used to be. Again, feminism is about female supremacy, but traditionalism is about female superiority. Superiority of the kind that a princess daughter of the nobility would view a commoner blacksmith who's highly experienced in his trade. Now this blacksmith produces. He's skilled, he's knowledgeable in his trade, he's valuable to society. He will, in the course of his lifetime, fashion countless artifacts of productivity and contributions in the form of a real, tangible product. He is orders of magnitude more useful to society and to nobility and to the marketplace where his goods are sold than the pampered princess who, by virtue of her nobility, considers herself inherently, even infinitely superior to the blacksmith. As far as she's concerned, the blacksmith exists solely because she might expect a level of craftsmanship in the metal that her harps are made of, that only the blacksmith can provide. And so if the king's decrees ever make it so that the blacksmith simply cannot afford to make harps anymore, she will appeal to her father, the king, to change his decrees. She cares nothing about the well-being of the blacksmith, or the sulfur he inhales in a process of metallurgy that gives her harps just the right harmonics that capture her fancy. She doesn't have an interest in the well-being of blacksmiths, but an interest in what blacksmiths do for her and her harps. Any intervention on her part on the side of the blacksmith might be received with great pleasure by the blacksmith. I mean, he may say to himself, look at the quality of my product, that the princess would take note of the lacking created by the king's decrees that made it too costly to create harps as I once did. He might swell with pride, and deep down he may even convince himself that the princess actually appreciates her loyal and lowly blacksmithing subject. He might tell his son, the next in line to pick up the trade, that one day this princess of the people will be his queen, and that he should never forget the attention once visited upon his father by the honorable princess who took note of his work and argued to the king himself on his behalf. Throughout all of this, of course, the princess will have always seen him as an insignificant peasant who exists to toil over scalding flames day in and day out so that she can play her little instrument, and that's all he'll ever be to her. And yet, convincing the blacksmith otherwise can often end up becoming an exercise in futility because it's what he wants to believe. He hates thinking that in the eyes of the princess, he may as well be an insignificant, albeit useful insect. And this is what traditionalism is. This is what social conservatism derives from. The female, her pedestalization, her feigned helplessness, and the man's desire to believe he's just that strapping singular example of manhood for the job. He's the only one that can step up to the plate and help these innocent Rapunzels who dangle their hair from the towers so that men can come up and slay the dragon. This is a process by which men ceremonialize their own enslavement. If you need men to die for you, tell those well-meaning fools that they can have meaningless trinkets pinned on their lapels for acts of military bravery. That'll make them feel better about it right away. You're still asking them to die, of course, but at the very least they can feel, I don't know, accepted. I still haven't figured out the motivations myself, but the point is that this is how the type of conversation that you just witnessed in this video has been allowed to become commonplace. I mean, it's such an amazing feat of cognitive dissonance that we just ignore this, that it would do us all a lot of good to say out loud what was actually discussed. I mean, let's just say this out loud here. What was said here is that the proper codes of conduct for humanity, the proper deal brokered between the genders, is one where men should feel compelled, like mindless lemmings, to drown, to die, so that women may live, with no other justification other than women are women and men are men. And that is violence. That is akin to saying that Asian people should die whenever white people or black people or Hispanics are in danger of dying, simply because, well, just because. Now, people try to explain it away with evolutionary psychology. They say, look at nature. It's full of male disposability, leaving out the fact that, of course, we created civilization, an artificial construct very distinct and separated from the chaos of nature, where we have philosophized and built rights that would never really exist without the artificial enforcement of civilization. We see this constant citation of the animal realm to justify male expendability, a realm which has no justice and no entitlements and certainly no rights. You see, when women stand to gain from male blood and sacrifice, we point right back to the animal barbarism we came out of. We ignore, almost as if by magic, the last 5,000 years of striving for civility. And like savages, we say, well, look at nature. It's everywhere in nature. In an instant, we're savages again. I mean, it's the way of the world. Men have always been disposable and always will be that way, so drown, you disposable fuck. Drown and like it, it's just the way it is. Of course, rape happens in nature all the time. And when it happens to women in human civilization, we go back to justice and liberty for all real fast then. And we, of course, should. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. Yet considering that expecting men to summarily drown themselves simply for being men and for the benefit of women is a crime that could easily equate in the caliber of evil to the crime of rape, this naturalistic view of the world seems a bit one-sided, doesn't it? So here we are, the supposed pinnacle of civilization, and it turns out that we haven't yet figured out that any self-professing civilization that is selectively civilized never was civilized to begin with. Our directional civility towards women and our look the other way attitude and our savagery towards men indicates to me that we never left the jungle. We're still a bunch of primitives and savages, but with technology and with medicine and with flammable carbon compounds that light up our homes. All of this technical prowess, yet when you strip away this surface decoration, the rights we claim to be universal and inalienable are nothing but artificial social constructs that our society selectively enforces, and when it can't get away with outright deprivation of these artificial rights, it creates social customs rooted in male expendability to mitigate these things. Now in this, we find the derivation of all of these other social customs designed only for men. We're talking about cultural memes like honor and chivalry. I mean, what are these things? They're buzzwords with no real fixed meaning, since these terms function as behavioral modifiers that rein in male self-interest. For the men of the Titanic, chivalry and honor meant nothing less than voluntarily discarding your life like a disposable piece of trash because of the implied superiority. Not supremacy, but superiority of women. You see, there's a definite difference between the feminist women and the traditional women, and the difference lies in how they reveal their disdain for the male gender. Female feminists view themselves as inferior to men, and this is evidenced by their obsessive need for female supremacy and their fixation with their simultaneous hatred and envy of men. You never see any creativity or invention or groundbreaking innovative thought coming from the feminists because they are fixated on one thing: men, specifically imitating them as a gauge of whether or not men are superior to them. Now, in the perception is reality world of female thought, they don't care if they have to use affirmative action and women's only college grants to do it. They worry only about being perceived as being equal to men, or at the very least creating an environment in which political correctness silences any discussion of any kind of male excellence they can't compete with. These are the actions of a child with full power to handicap an adult she's obsessed at imitating, but feebly grasping somewhere in her mind that she isn't an adult, and so she hates the adult she so desperately wishes to emulate because even with all the handicaps, the adult still excels. Feminists seek to dominate men, and the need to dominate always comes out of a position of fear and weakness. One does not seek to dominate an irrelevant non-factor, one dominates what they feel threatened by. The female feminist seeks to disprove the inferiority she suspects of herself by establishing supremacy over what she views as her superior, the male. The traditional woman, however, is most certainly not threatened by men. She's infantilized as the feminist is, but she doesn't fear men. The traditional woman betrays her belief in her own superiority by feigning inferiority. She sees herself as superior to men. She sees herself as existing to be served by men. She doesn't dwell on the superiority she believes herself to have. This feeling of superiority is as drilled into her as much as the conditioning that boys receive from the earliest ages, telling them that they must serve and protect for women at all times. She experiences her sense of superiority on an almost unconscious level. She is a superior geisha, let's call her that, who can't be troubled with the unpleasantries of male life. Her place is among the finer things, the safe things, the gentle things, and she expects men to fulfill their role by granting her access to this delicate and leisurely existence that is her birthright. And men better damn well bear the brunt of everything unpleasant for her, lest her field of vision be sullied by the less than ideal facets of reality. So essentially, it's a fancy way on her part of imagining superiority of the infantilized adult child that the traditional woman is. Now, what do I mean by the infantilized adult child? This is a term I've often used but haven't given a fixed definition to.